Hi, Bernie. It's so wonderful to be here speaking with you. Um, Such a huge respecter of your work, and it's hard to believe that I haven't seen you in real life since 2018 when you were featured as part of Social Work, the Spotlight exhibition at Frieze London in 2018. So, how have you been?
I've been good, thanks. And yes, it is a long time since we've seen each other. I'm sure we would have seen each other sooner had we not been dealing with the pandemic. But it is, of course, so nice to connect with you, even if it is virtually.
Oh, no, I'm really happy about this. I think that's the one thing that Zoom makes possible, the connections that we otherwise couldn't have. So this is a really exciting occasion because you're being able to show work as part of your first digital solo exhibition at Richard Saltoun Gallery now in 2021. And it's building on a body of work that you made 10 years ago. Is that correct? In 2011. And so I feel like we should start there. So the work from 2021 is called Mantle. And as I've just said, it builds upon an ambitious body of work that you displayed in Europe in 2011 called Interlaced. And so, if I can quote you back to yourself, in the catalog for that 2011 publication, you spoke about the beauty of ambiguity, and you state that there's mutability in relation to the concept of identity. And I think that that's a wonderful place to start, of something not being fixed. And even with the work Interlaced, you've been able to take a conception and then move it forward a decade on. So perhaps we can start there.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you're raising and that I've commented on before in terms of identity and mutability has always been a concern of mine in my work, particularly because presenting and talking about identity for me really needs to be framed within a concept that is changing, within a context that is changing, and that is flexible and fluid in any given context and in different contexts. So even, you know, the work that's being shown at Richard Saltoun Gallery is, it actually precedes 2011, because we're also showing another piece called Seeking Refuge, which is 2008. And so it does span quite a period of time. But the issue of including the body and it being transformed in some way as the works evolve, and of course with time-based work, video, as it progresses from one stage to a next. And I think in that progression of time, there's an opportunity for things to change and to morph, and to become, to both appear and disappear over time. And so mutability, disappearance, and appearance and visibility have all been part of my concerns in my work.
I really appreciate that. And I'm very excited that Seeking Refuge is something that people will be able to see, because that was the previous time that we were together in London, when Seeking Refuge was part of this South African artist's film screening that I organized and that I was so happy that you were a part of, that happened at Tate Modern in 2015. So already like moving back in time now. But maybe if we alight there with Seeking Refuge and thinking about moving image work in the way that you've just framed these kind of notions of fluidity and flexibility, and of things being neither one nor the other, but both and. That brings me to something that I find recurs in your practice, and that's how you're able to, in very powerfully aesthetic ways, fuse the body and the landscape. And certainly that's something that happens in Seeking Refuge. Are you often thinking about those two thematics as well, not as binaries, but as two pieces of a whole?
Yes, well, certainly in Seeking Refuge, which just a bit of background, was shot on the island of Lanzarote, where issues of migration, comes to bear in that part of the world, particularly people coming from Europe and of course to northern African countries, and in this case the Canary Islands. And it was a response to the particular environment, which in this case was a landscape. With Interlaced, it was also a response to that context of Belgium and particularly Bruges, but featured in an architectural kind of the body in an architectural setting in a piece like Interlaced, as opposed to Seeking Refuge. I think that the encounter that any migrant might have going to a new place, the first encounter is with the landscape. And so I found that an appropriate way to talk about arriving at a particular place, often under very harsh and difficult circumstances, and then being able to find ways to survive in not only a landscape, but a social environment, which often is quite alienating. And so I think for me, the landscape was pertinent there as a point of arrival and a point of departure.
Right. So again, we've got that simultaneity, that something can be both things at once. So if we move ourselves to Bruges, as you were mentioning, in a work like Interlaced, we see that, and it's recurred throughout your practice, that the body is this primary site of identification in your work. But I feel that just as important is the power of the very subtle gesture. So can you talk me through how you choreograph or think about movement in the context of how you use your own body in your work?
Yes. Well, of course, using my own body in relation to the context that the work is shot in entails a performative. There's a performative aspect of it, which I think is partly what you are touching on, and to a large extent, what I do in any given context is thought through as an initial idea. I do think, though, that there are other factors that come to play when you actually make the work, which sometimes can be a spontaneous response to what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're hearing at the time. So I think it's a combination of what I might have in mind and what occurs quite organically. I would say that generally speaking, I do have quite a particular idea in mind, but I'm open to what might transpire in any given moment as well. So I think that in terms of generally speaking and in terms of Interlaced, the performative aspect of the video is relatively pared down. I think that I try to communicate with subtle gestures, and often in a continuous time frame. So in other words, with very little editing and a sense of how one thing will evolve to another, or my own sense of it anyway, before we actually do the work. And that then does have a consideration of how I start, what I do, the expression on my face, the elements that I incorporate, because it's the body, but it's the body in relation, let's say, to a cloak, a piece of material, and there is a sense of, in my head anyway, of what should transpire, but in a very, as I say, pared down, gestural, and I suppose emotive way, rather than a very physical performance. So I think there's this a quietness about the performance, or the performative quality in the work generally, which certainly comes out in Interlaced.
I think that's true. That this notion of the subtle gesture, the way that, the movement of a hand, or the contrast between lace and skin. I think all of those things attune the viewer in a particularly poetic way. And so I think in the same way that the gesture made me think about your relationship to the body, I'm also interested in the processes that you go through. As earlier you were speaking about this notion of having a concept, but then also being open to what we might think of as improvisation, but also how you come to the materials that are going to be part of the frame that you're interacting with, or that are in many ways kind of carrying the narrative, or that are imbued with the histories that you're exploring.
Yes, and I think there's a sense of these elements being quite pared down as well. And so it would in a piece like Seeking Refuge, just to go back to that piece, it literally is a black cloth that I traverse the landscape, and which I use in many different ways, in different locations. So it could be a shelter, it could be a covering, it could be a flag. So a simple black cloth can stand in for so many different associations. And in that piece, it was particularly about surviving in a inhospitable landscape. And I suppose the ingenuity that one has in terms of how one can use, a cloth, and again, symbolically speaking, but also practically speaking, when one is doing a shoot, and it really, in a very harsh landscape, to actually work in the landscape was really difficult, and it has its own set of challenges. But the ability of that material then to speak, one fabric to speak in so many different ways, and just to elaborate on the materiality aspect, often the materials which are quite pared down is in conversation with parts of the body that have been altered to communicate or to reference and associate with the kinds of ideas that I'm thinking about. So in a piece like Seeking Refuge, I've painted gloves on my hands and shoes on my feet. And of course, the gloves actually don't serve, it doesn't serve any function, neither do the painted shoes. And it's done with a material called, well, they're bugs really that are crushed to create this deep crimson color. It's also one of the things that people do there to make a living as an export of, from this particular part of the world. So trying to find a material that can speak to the experiences that people might have had, or might have encountered in that environment. In the Interlaced video, I put gold leaf. I painted my hands gold leaf, just the till the wrist, and my feet as well. Although my feet don't actually enter into the video. For the performance, I actually did apply gold leaf to both my hands and feet. Again, in an attempt to in a very pared down way reference the practice of severing limbs in the Congo, you know, which is of course part of a very troubled and brutal history.
An incredibly violent colonial history.
Yes, absolutely. And so being in Bruges, in an ornate town hall where there's so many gold elements visually coming out anyway, these hands speak to that history that is evident in the context, you know, and that is, it was shot in the town hall in Bruges. And even though it looks like a church, it has the feeling of being a church. It's actually a secular building. It's a town hall. It's a place of civic engagement, and it's a place where decisions are made in relation to the city and the broader area. And the context, well, I was speaking about the gold on the hands. It's so besides the Congo, it also speaks to the paintings on the walls, which has a particular artistic tradition, as a kind of Gothic ornate embellishments that one encounters in a space like that. But
really opulent, yeah, absolutely, very opulent space.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, I draw on that as well. So when just to go back right to the beginning of our conversation, where you say it's and or, it's either or, it's and or either. There's so many associations that those gold hands can have in terms of the political, civil conditions or context, the religious, the secular. And yeah, I suppose also it touches on the political, but class, because there is a part in interlaced which is quite decorative. It's the part where it has this metal grill, and was shot in an adjoining space to the town hall, which contains in the 1200s, the earliest, I suppose, formations of what we today would call trade unions. And so guilds of workers would lay down conditions which were quite separate from the state or from the monarchy. And so I think these aspects also come into the work.
I really loved what you said about being evident in the context, because even as you're describing this kind of civic building that has these kind of almost sacred ornamentations, I think what's interesting is that what you've drawn out is a history that people going in that space might not take as evident. They wouldn't, from the look of the gold, trace it back to the history of King Leopold, or an incredibly brutal Belgian dominance in Congolese region. But what it does is you're able to use the medium of moving image to then attune our eye to see that, and to question the materials that we're looking at in such a particular way, or to look at them again in a new light. And so this is going back some, and is a little bit more of a personal question, but I'm really eager to learn what it was that first drew you to video as an expressive medium.
So I actually come from a sculptural background. I majored in sculpture when I was studying, and it took me a long time to get, firstly, to the medium of photography, and I think I found it quite limiting, the sculptural process, particularly of molding something, having a cast. I found it not, in a way, didn't speak as directly to my concerns as I wanted to. And so the inclusion of my body in the work, and firstly as photographs, as I said, for me could speak more directly in terms of being able to communicate my ideas. And I suppose the photograph also has this, we know that photographs do lie and they're not realistic, and but there is something quite immediate in the photographic image that I think speaks more directly and could speak for me in terms of my concerns in a much more appropriate and effective way. Of course, then including myself in the work would also be something that adds a part that one can do in photographs and in video that you can't quite do in a medium like sculpture, which is mediated by so many processes and materials. And I think that video then developed out of working with photographs. And so I could see that already by combining certain photographs, there was a progression which suggested that, or occurred to me, needed to be explored further, and the appropriate medium would then be video. And so it was a process to get to the point of the medium really that I thought spoke best and most effectively to my concerns. And I think when I got an opportunity, it was the first opportunity to make a video was in 2001 for the Authentic Eccentric show at the Venice Biennale. And that was the first video I made with very little technical knowledge, but an idea. And I've been working in a combination of video and photography and installations since then.
I think that's a really helpful place for everyone who's listening and watching to anchor their understanding of your practice, because then what comes through in your having found the medium, or the medium having found you, is really seeking out this kind of space where the inherent recognition, or the recognizability of how we read a photographic image, or think, oh, okay, I can perhaps find myself within this. There's an immediacy where it seems in your work so much that you're able to kind of grip the viewer and then to take us on this journey. So maybe as a way of thinking through what's next for you in that process, what are some of the themes that are preoccupying your working practice now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the kind of work that I did, let's say in, the beginning of 2001 in the Color Me series, which was very much about the body and a particular point in time in history in South Africa, spoke in a way that was related to the absence and of an articulation of the experience of the Black body, particularly the Black female body in, let's say, South African visual art at the time. And I think my work changes, as our context changes, and post 1994, for example, we had an increasing amount of protests, and these were mainly in relation to service delivery and the disappointment, I suppose, in the lack of deliverables in terms of this, new dispensation. So actually, in the background here, you can see some of my burning tires, which relates to a series called Black Smoke Rising, which responded to that to that particular set of circumstances in 2010. And more recently, I am I'm interested in the ways in which our aspirations have not been met in terms of the lived experiences on a day-to-day level for many people in South Africa.
The promises of the post-apartheid moment having been unfulfilled, and it unfulfilled in ways that you'd mentioned in the 2010 uprisings, and also that continue with fees must fall or roads must fall, in a sense that what will it take to achieve equity in terms of educational attainment, in terms of a public life that isn't haunted by the specter of white supremacy. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't word it in that quite that way, but absolutely, it is about looking at the manifestations that still exist as a result of where we're coming from, and they might seem quite subtle, but it really does inform the material conditions under which people still live and struggle, in South Africa. So, for example, the issue of the urban environment and the built environment, and how it caters or doesn't cater for a greater integration of people, not only from various backgrounds, but from various class positions. So, homelessness, for example, is a huge issue. And it still affects a certain demographic, in the same way we talk about education. It's the lack of access to education is still predominantly an issue for a particular demographic. So I'm interested in how this plays out in people's lives, and how access is still somewhat limited. And yeah.
I think what I appreciate so much in your work is how you can take these big, important kind of sociocultural conditions and the big problems and concerns of our time, but you personalize it. You don't keep yourself at arm's length from it. The fact that you are fundamentally within it and grappling with it in a way that has ultimately a lot of tenderness and vulnerability that comes through in the work. That's just an observation, but it's something that I think is important and very poignant in terms of how you're able to grapple with these things, but in ways that don't end up being didactic. I think there's
exactly
a lot
the word that I had in my mind,
but without didacticism.
Yes, that's exactly the word I had in mind, and you said it before I could say it. Yes, because I think it's, for me, it's not about a form of sloganeering, and it's about opening up these concerns for contemplation, for discussion, for reflection, and it may speak more directly to some people than to other people, in the way that it is, understood, especially with different elements, like a burning tire would speak, of course, to our particular context in a very sinister way. But I think
you're referring to the history of necklacing.
Yes,
it's very painful, and so I think the way that, even as you were describing it, that's something that can then be reinterpreted in a manner that holds the space. I mean, it's holding it right behind you, but that can speak to ongoing histories and problems that, as we said, these kind of promises that remain unfulfilled, is very symbolic.
Yes, and I think there's a suggestion of things falling apart. Things are not this, there's something that's worrying, even though what we presented with is often quite lyrical and poetic. And of course, with placing the body within any of these scenarios, does emphasize and bring out the vulnerability within within these contexts. But as you say, I tend to do it in quite a subtle way, so that my concerns are raised, but I'm not forcing anyone to see it in a particular way, but that it evokes some of the ideas and concerns that I have.
I think fundamentally you're not telling us what to think, but the works are spurs to think, for us to think through this. And so given that, I just think it's such a gift to be able to see your work online as part of this show, and for people to have access to both Mantle and earlier works as well. So thank you so much for your time and for the work.
Thank you, Zoe. It was wonderful talking to you. And I hope